There are times that you want to have control over the behavior of DOM elements. For example, look at this input field here. If I type my name like this and press tab, note that my name becomes lowercase. Now, this is a simplified example. In a real-world application, you may want to add this behavior. So let's say we have an input field for the user to enter their phone number. So they add 12345678890. Now, the standard way to format an American phone number is like this. So the first 3 digits in parentheses, then 3 more digits, and then a hyphen. So as the user types their phone number into this input field and moves away, you may want to reformat this value using a standard American phone number format. In situations like that, we use directives. So let me show you how to implement a simple directive in Angular. Now, similar to components and services, we can create a directive from scratch, or we can use Angular CLI to generate a directive with some boilerplate code. So open up the terminal and type ng g d for directive, and let's call this directive input-format. So this creates 2 files. One is a unit test file and the other is the actual directive file. And it also modifies app.module. So let's quickly go to app module. In our ng module, inside declarations, you can see now we have input format directive. So as I told you before, in this declarations array, we should register all the components, all the pipes, and all the directives that are part of this module. If you don't do this, you're going to get a runtime error. Now let's go to our input format directive. So this is very similar to a component. You can see we have a TypeScript class called input format directive, and this class is decorated with the directive decorator function. Here we have a selector, exactly like components, but the selector has square brackets, which basically means any elements that has this attribute, app input format. If Angular finds an element with this attribute, it's going to apply this directive on that element. Now, as a best practice, it's good to prefix your directives so they don't clash with the standard HTML attributes or other directives defined in third-party libraries. So here we have app as a prefix to app input format directive. Now let's move on to the actual implementation of this directive. So here we want to handle 2 DOM events, focus and blur. First, on the top, we need to import a decorator function, host listener from Angular/core. This decorator allows us to subscribe to the events raised from the DOM element, that is the DOM element that is hosting this directive, or in other words, that's the DOM element that has this attribute. So let's see how we can use host listener. First, I'm going to define a method here on focus. So whenever we get the focus in our input field, we want this method to be called. For now, I just want to log something in the console on focus. Now we need to decorate this method with the host listener decorator. So @ host listener. And as the argument, we need to supply the name of the DOM event, that is focus. Now I'm going to select this code, duplicate it, and change the second instance to blur, unblur, and unblur. Let's test the application up to this point. So let's go to app.component.html. Here I'm going to add an input and apply app input format attribute on this element. With this attribute, Angular is going to apply our custom directive to this input field. So let's test this. Back in the browser. So here's our input field. I'm going to click here and then outside. Now let's take a look at the console. So we have these 2 messages, on focus and on blur. Now let's implement the logic to change the value of this input field to a lowercase string. In this particular demo, we don't really need this on focus. I just wanted to show you how it works because we do the formatting once the user clicks outside this input field. So let's delete this. In on blur, I need to get the value for this input field. First, we need a reference to the host element. So in our constructor, we need to inject an element reference object. So private L of type element ref. This is a service defined in Angular that gives us access to a DOM object. So let's import this on the top. You can see this is defined in Angular/core. Okay. Now, as a best practice, we should always put our constructors before all our methods. So this tells me immediately what are the dependencies of this class. Now in onBlur, first we need to read the value of this input field. So let value equal this.l, and here we access the native element property. This gives us access to the actual DOM object. So from here we can read the value property, and then we can simply set this.l.nativeElement.value to value dot. Now here the type of value is any, as you can see here. So I'm going to use type annotation to tell TypeScript compiler that this is actually a string. And with this, we can access all the methods defined in the string class. So here I'm going to use 2 lowercase. Let's test the application. So back in the browser, I'm going to type my name here, press tab, beautiful. Now it's lowercase. Now back in app component.html, it would be nice to have the flexibility to tell the directive about the target format. Maybe here we want to reformat this string as lowercase, but somewhere else we want to reformat it as uppercase. So if we had a property like format, then we could use property binding like this. We can set this to uppercase string. Note that here I've put my uppercase word in single quotes to specify that this is a string, not a property of the app component. Okay? So how do we implement this? You should already know. We're going to define a field called format and mark it as an input property. As simple as that. So back in our directive, let's define this new field, format, and decorate it with the input decorator. Now, as a best practice, I told you always use a string alias here to keep the contract of your directives or your components stable. Now finally, we need to import this type from Angular/core. And then in onBlur method, we can check if this.format equals lowercase. We will reformat this string as lowercase. Otherwise, we're going to reformat it as uppercase. Okay, that's better. So let's go back to our app component.html. Here I have used uppercase. So let's test the application. I'm going to type my name one more time. Tab. Now it's uppercase. Beautiful. The only issue here is that we have to apply this directive as an attribute and then use property binding to set the target format. Since we have only one input property here, it would be nicer to set the target format while applying the directive as an attribute, like this. We could use square brackets here and then set this to uppercase. Then we wouldn't have to bind to the format property. This is cleaner, right? So how can we implement this? Very easy. Let's go back to our directive. So all we have to do here is to change this format to the selector of our directive. So app input format. Let's try it. Back in the browser, I'm going to type my name, tab, beautiful. So here's the lesson. You can use custom directives to have more control over behavior of DOM elements. You can pass data to your directives using input properties. And if you have only one property, you can use the selector of that directive as an alias for that property. And this simplifies the usage of your custom directive. And finally, you can use the host listener decorator to subscribe to the events raised from the host DOM object.